After days of silence, Tasila Lungu has finally spoken, and her words to the Zambian government are bold, emotional, and powerful. She's defending her father's legacy and standing firm against what she calls political interference in her family's mourning process. Speaking head, Tasila Lungu, daughter of former President Dr. Edgar Chagwa Lungu, has broken her silence, and her words are resonating across Zambia. She's issued a powerful response to the Zambian government amid the ongoing burial controversy and legal battles. In this emotional address, Tasila defends her family's right to mourn, honors her father's legacy, and calls out what she believes is state interference. In this video, you'll learn what Tasila Lungu said in her statement, how the government has responded, public reaction across Zambia, what this means for the funeral and legacy of ECL. Watch now, only on InspirAfrica Official, your #1 source for fearless, real Zambian news. 1. What Tasila Lungu said in her statement. Context of Tasila Lungu's statement. Tasila Lungu, daughter of Zambia's former President Edgar Chagwa Lungu, announced her father's death on June 5, 2025, in a video posted on the Patriotic Front (PF) party's social media platforms. As a member of parliament for Chihuahua and a prominent figure in the Lungu family, her statement carried significant weight both emotionally and politically, given the contentious relationship between her father and the current Zambian government led by President Hakainde Hichilema. Her announcement was not only a confirmation of Edgar Lungu's passing, but also a reflection of the family's grief and their call for national unity during a time of mourning. The statement was delivered from South Africa, where Edgar Lungu died while receiving medical treatment, and it set the stage for the subsequent disputes over his funeral arrangements. Content of the statement. In her emotional 1-minute video, Tasila Lungu confirmed that her father, Edgar Lungu, passed away at 6 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time on June 5, 2025 at the Mediclinic Med Forum in Pretoria, South Africa, where he had been under medical supervision for an undisclosed illness. She emphasized that he was treated with dignity and privacy during his final days, a point that subtly contrasted with the family's later accusations of mistreatment by the Zambian government during Lungu's lifetime. Tasila did not disclose the specific cause of death, but noted that her father had been receiving specialized treatment consistent with his history of health issues, including a surgery a decade earlier for achalasia, a condition causing a narrowing of the esophagus. The most poignant part of her statement was her invocation of the Zambian national motto, One Zambia, One Nation, which she described as the timeless creed that guided President Lungu's service to our country. This appeal for unity was significant in the context of Zambia's polarized political climate, particularly the long-standing feud between Edgar Lungu and Hakainde Hichilema. By invoking this motto, Tasila was not only honoring her father's legacy, but also signaling the family's desire to transcend the political divisions that had marked his post-presidency years. However, the call for unity also hinted at underlying tensions, as it came at a time when social media rumors about Lungu's death were circulating, and the government had yet to issue an official statement. Tone and implications. Tasila's statement was marked by a somber and restrained tone, reflecting her personal grief as a daughter. Her choice to deliver the announcement herself, rather than through a government channel, underscored the family's intent to control the narrative surrounding Edgar Lungu's death. The absence of an immediate response from President Hichilema, which Tasila's statement indirectly highlighted, fueled speculation and criticism among Lungu supporters, who saw it as a sign of disrespect or political maneuvering. The statement set the tone for the subsequent funeral disputes, as it emphasized the family's desire for a dignified process, which they later argued was being undermined by the government's actions. Broader context. Tasila's statement must be understood within the context of the Lungu family's fraught relationship with the Hichilema administration. Edgar Lungu, who served as Zambia's president from 2015 to 2021, had faced significant political and legal challenges after losing the 2021 election to Hichilema. These included allegations of police harassment, restrictions on his movements, and corruption investigations targeting his family, including Tasila herself, who was arrested in February 2025 on money laundering charges. Her statement, therefore, was not just a mourning daughter's announcement, but also a political act, signaling the family's resolve to honor Edgar Lungu's legacy on their terms, free from what they perceived as government interference. 2. How the government has responded. Initial government response. The Zambian government's response to Edgar Lungu's death was initially slow, which drew criticism from Lungu supporters and the Patriotic Front (PF). President Hakainde Hichilema issued a condolence message 3 hours after Tasila's announcement via a text post on Facebook, calling for solemnity, unity, and an outpouring of love and compassion. He reiterated the need to uphold the values of peace, dignity, and togetherness that define us as Zambians. However, this message was perceived by some as belated and hollow, particularly given the history of animosity between Hichilema and Lungu. Information Minister Cornelius Mwitwa defended the delay, stating that precedent did not require the head of state to be the first to announce a predecessor's passing, but this explanation did little to quell the dissatisfaction among Lungu supporters. The government declared a 7-day national mourning period starting on June 7, 2025, with flags to be flown at half-mast, and designated a government-owned lodge in Lusaka as the official venue for mourning. This declaration came a day after the PF announced its own mourning period, highlighting the competing narratives between the government and Lungu's party. The government's insistence on controlling the mourning process, including the venue, family, set the stage for the subsequent standoff with the Lungu family and the PF. Push for a state funeral. The Zambian government, led by Hichilema, expressed a strong desire to accord Edgar Lungu a state funeral, citing his status as a former president and the national interest in honoring him appropriately. The government planned to repatriate Lungu's body from South Africa for a state funeral in Lusaka on June 22, 2025, with full military honors at a designated cemetery where other former presidents are buried, such as Embassy Memorial Park. Foreign Minister Malambo Hainby emphasized that Lungu's funeral was a matter of public interest, stating, "I'm sure all of us would want to have a fitting send-off for our former president, and that is what we must work towards achieving." To facilitate this, the government sent envoys, including Hainby, to South Africa to negotiate with Lungu's widow, Esther, and daughter, Tasila, to resolve the deadlock over funeral arrangements. The government initially reached an agreement with the family for a state funeral, with Hichilema set to preside over the ceremony. However, this agreement broke down when the family accused the government of deviating from the agreed terms, particularly regarding Hichilema's role in receiving Lungu's remains and presiding over the funeral. Legal action in South Africa. Tensions escalated when the Zambian government filed an urgent case in the Pretoria High Court on June 25, 2025, to halt a private burial organized by the Lungu family in Johannesburg. The government, through Attorney General Mulalo Kabesha, argued that Lungu, as a former president, belongs to the nation of Zambia and should be buried in Zambia with full military honors, citing historical precedent and national interest. The court granted an injunction, stopping the burial just hours before it was scheduled to take place at the Cathedral of Christ the King in Johannesburg, forcing mourners to hold a prayer service instead. The court ordered a full hearing on August 4, 2025, giving the government until July 4 to submit its arguments and the family until July 11 to respond. This legal action was a significant point of contention, as the Lungu family and their spokesman, Makibi Zulu, accused the government of disrespecting their grief and attempting to politicize the funeral for public relations purposes. The government's insistence on repatriation and its legal challenge were seen by the family as an attempt to override Edgar Lungu's explicit instructions that Hichilema should not be involved in his funeral. Government's stance on unity and legacy. Throughout the dispute, the government maintained that its actions were motivated by a desire to honor Lungu's legacy and unite the nation. Hichilema and his officials, including Foreign Minister Hainby and Cabinet Secretary Patrick Kangwa, repeatedly called for peace and unity, framing the state funeral as a national event that transcended personal or political differences. The government also cited the precedent of Kenneth Konda's funeral in 2021, where the state overruled the family's wishes to bury him next to his wife, arguing that national interest takes precedence over individual or family preferences. However, the government's actions were complicated by its history of targeting Lungu and his family. During Hichilema's presidency, Lungu had accused the government of restricting his movements, placing him under virtual house arrest, and preventing him from traveling abroad for medical treatment. The government denied these allegations, with Information Minister Mwitwa calling them fiction and a figment of the imagination of politically charged mindsets. Additionally, the government's anti-corruption crusade had led to investigations and charges against Lungu's widow, Esther, and children, including Tasila, for alleged fraud and money laundering, which they denied. These actions fueled perceptions that the government's push for a state funeral was less about honoring Lungu and more about controlling his legacy for political gain. Diplomatic efforts. The Zambian government also engaged South African authorities in the dispute, with Hichilema apologizing to President Cyril Ramaphosa for the inconvenience caused by the funeral row. South African Minister of International Relations Ronald Lamola met with Hichilema to discuss the impasse, and South Africa's non-interference in the family's initial decision to bury Lungu in Johannesburg was noted by the family's spokesman Makibi Zulu, who thanked the South African government for its respect. However, the Zambian government's legal action in South Africa strained these diplomatic relations, as it highlighted the international dimensions of the dispute. 3. Public reaction across Zambia. Shock and grief. The death of Edgar Lungu on June 5, 2025, at the age of 68, shocked Zambians, as he had remained a prominent and influential figure in national politics despite his electoral defeat in 2021. As a former president who led Zambia from 2015 to 2021, Lungu was a polarizing figure, praised for his infrastructure development programs but criticized for economic mismanagement and allegations of authoritarianism. His passing elicited a genuine sense of grief across the country, particularly among his supporters and members of the Patriotic Front (PF). Radio stations played gospel music, reflecting Zambia's status as a Christian nation where mourning periods are taken seriously. Confusion and division. The funeral dispute between the Lungu family, the PF, and the government created significant confusion and sadness among Zambians. The government's declaration of a state funeral and an official mourning venue at a Lusaka lodge was contradicted by the PF's directive for mourners to gather at its headquarters, leaving the public unclear about how to honor the former president. This standoff was exacerbated by the government's legal action in South Africa, which halted the planned burial in Johannesburg and further further polarized public sentiment. Lungu's supporters, particularly within the PF, expressed outrage at what they perceived as the government's politicization of his death. The PF's acting president, Given Labinda, accused the government of turning a solemn occasion into a political game, arguing that it was disrespectful to Lungu's memory. Social media platforms, particularly X, saw heated debates, with some users praising the Lungu family for standing firm against government interference, while others supported the government's position that a former president's funeral should be a national event. Support for the Lungu family. A significant portion of the Zambian public, especially PF supporters, rallied behind the Lungu family, viewing their resistance to a state funeral as a legitimate response to perceived political targeting. The family's insistence on honoring Edgar Lungu's wish that Hichilema not be involved resonated with those who believed the government had mistreated Lungu during his post-presidency years. Civil society groups, including the Council of Churches in Zambia led by Emmanuel Chikoya, called for dialogue and a resolution that respected the family's wishes while maintaining national unity. Chikoya's statement that the standoff was hurting the dignity of our country reflected widespread public frustration with the ongoing dispute. Criticism of the government. The government's handling of the funeral arrangements drew significant criticism, particularly from Lungu's supporters, who felt that Hichilema's administration was using the funeral to project an image of unity while ignoring its history of hostility toward Lungu. The delay in Hichilema's condolence message, the legal action in South Africa, and the insistence on a state funeral were seen as attempts to control the narrative around Lungu's legacy. Some Zambians, including constitutional lawyer John Sangwa, argued that the government should respect the family's wishes, highlighting the need for a clear legal framework to govern the funerals of former presidents. Calls for unity. Despite the divisions, there were also calls for unity from various quarters. Religious leaders, civil society organizations, and some political figures urged both sides to prioritize national healing over personal or political grievances. The invocation of One Zambia, One Nation by both Tasila Lungu and President Hichilema reflected a shared recognition of the need to bridge the divide, though their approaches differed significantly. Public sentiment, as reflected in media reports and social media discussions, was torn between grief for Lungu, frustration with the funeral dispute, and a desire for a dignified resolution. 4. What this means for the funeral and legacy of Edgar Lungu. Impact on the funeral. The dispute over Edgar Lungu's funeral has had profound implications for how his final send-off is conducted. Initially, the government and the Lungu family reached an agreement for a state funeral in Lusaka on June 22, 2025, with Hichilema presiding. However, the family's distrust of the government's intentions, particularly regarding Hichilema's involvement, led to the collapse of this agreement. On June 20, 2025, the family announced that Lungu would be buried in South Africa in a private ceremony, a decision that marked the first time a former Zambian president would be buried outside the country. This plan was disrupted when the Zambian government obtained a court order from the Pretoria High Court on June 25, 2025, halting the burial in Johannesburg. The court's ruling, which postponed the funeral until a hearing on August 4, 2025, left the process in limbo, causing distress among mourners and further complicating the family's efforts to honor Lungu's wishes. The family's spokesman, Makibi Zulu, emphasized their desire for a dignified burial free from political interference, while the government argued that Lungu's status as a former president necessitated a state funeral in Zambia. As of July 5, 2025, the funeral remains unresolved, with the Lungu family rejecting the government's proposal for mediation, describing it as insincere and disrespectful. The ongoing legal battle in South Africa and the family's refusal to repatriate Lungu's body suggest that the funeral may ultimately take place in South Africa, setting a precedent that could challenge Zambia's traditions for honoring former heads of state. Impact on Edgar Lungu's legacy. Edgar Lungu's legacy is a complex and contested one, shaped by his 6-year presidency, his post-presidency struggles, and the current funeral dispute. During his tenure from 2015 to 2021, Lungu was praised for his ambitious infrastructure projects, particularly road-building programs that improved regional connectivity. However, his presidency was also marked by economic challenges, including Zambia's default on its international debt in 2020, high unemployment, and rising inflation, which contributed to his electoral loss in 2021. Allegations of corruption involving his allies and family, as well as accusations of authoritarianism, further tarnished his reputation among critics. The funeral dispute has amplified these divisions, with Lungu supporters viewing him as a victim of political persecution by the Hichilema administration. The government's actions, including the anti-corruption investigations targeting Lungu's family and the Constitutional Court's ruling barring him from running for president again in 2026, have fueled narratives of political targeting. The family's decision to bury Lungu in South Africa, if realized, could symbolize their rejection of the Zambian government's authority over his legacy, reinforcing the perception among supporters that Lungu was unfairly treated. Conversely, the government's push for a state funeral aims to frame Lungu's legacy within a national context, emphasizing his role as a former president who served the country. By insisting on a burial in Zambia with full military honors, the government seeks to present itself as magnanimous, rising above past rivalries to honor a national figure. However, this narrative is undermined by the family's accusations and the public's awareness of the Hichilema Lungu feud, which included Hichilema's 100-day detention on treason charges in 2017 under Lungu's presidency. The funeral dispute risks overshadowing Lungu's contributions, such as his constitutional reforms in 2016, which reduced presidential powers, and his efforts to unite the PF during his presidency. It also highlights the broader challenge of managing the legacies of polarizing figures in Zambia's multi-party democracy. The absence of a clear legal framework for handling former presidents' funerals, as noted by constitutional lawyer Edgar Chagwa, underscores the need for institutional reforms to prevent such disputes from recurring. 5. Tasila Lungu breaks silence. Significance of Tasila's public role. Tasila Lungu's decision to break her silence through the video announcement was a pivotal moment in the unfolding drama surrounding her father's death. As a member of parliament and one of Edgar Lungu's 6 children, Tasila has been a visible figure in Zambian politics, often seen as a defender of her father's legacy. Her arrest in February 2025 on money laundering charges, alongside her mother, Esther, and sister, further elevated her profile as a target of the Hichilema administration's anti-corruption campaign. By choosing to announce her father's death herself, Tasila asserted the family's agency in shaping the narrative, bypassing government channels and setting the tone for their subsequent resistance to a state funeral. Message to the government. While Tasila's initial statement did not directly address the government, its invocation of One Zambia, One Nation was a subtle challenge to Hichilema's administration to respect the family's wishes and prioritize national unity. The absence of an immediate government response amplified this message, as it suggested a lack of coordination or respect for Lungu's legacy. Subsequent statements from the family, particularly through their spokesman, Makibi Zulu, made their message to the government explicit. They demanded control over the funeral arrangements and insisted that Hichilema, whom Lungu had explicitly instructed to stay away, should not be involved. The family's rejection of mediation, as reported on July 3, 2025 by the Zambian Observer, was a direct rebuke of the government's approach. They described the government's proposal as insincere and criticized the legal action in South Africa as disrespectful, particularly the decision to drag Esther Lungu, the grieving widow, to court. This stance was encapsulated in the statement, "You don't sue a grieving widow, then call for dialogue," highlighting the family's perception of the government's actions as hypocritical and politically motivated. 6. Her message to the government. Explicit demands. Through Makibi Zulu, the Lungu family articulated a clear message to the government: respect Edgar Lungu's wishes for a private funeral and refrain from politicizing his death. The family's insistence that Hichilema not be involved stemmed from Lungu's explicit instructions, rooted in their long-standing rivalry. The family accused the government of attempting to use the funeral as a public relations stunt to cleanse its image with the world, particularly given the allegations of persecution during Lungu's post-presidency years. Accusations of bad faith. The family's rejection of mediation and their decision to halt the repatriation of Lungu's body on June 19, 2025, were based on their belief that the government had breached agreed-upon terms for the state funeral. They cited the government's unilateral release of a draft funeral program without consultation as evidence of bad faith. The family's statements, particularly through Zulu, emphasized their desire for a dignified burial that honored Lungu's wishes, free from what they saw as government interference. 7. Public support for the Lungu family. Grassroots support. The Lungu family garnered significant support from PF members and Lungu's base, who viewed the funeral dispute as an extension of the political targeting they believed Lungu endured after 2021. Social media platforms, including X, saw an outpouring of sympathy for the family, with many users praising Tasila and Esther Lungu for standing up to the government. The PF's decision to direct mourners to its headquarters rather than the government's designated lodge further galvanized support among Lungu's loyalists, who saw the party as a defender of his legacy. Civil society and religious leaders. Civil society groups, such as the Council of Churches in Zambia, expressed support for the family's right to control the funeral arrangements, urging dialogue to resolve the dispute. Constitutional lawyer Edgar Chagwa's statement that the family's wishes should be respected resonated with those who felt the government was overreaching. Religious leaders, in particular, emphasized the need for a resolution that preserved Zambia's dignity and unity, reflecting the broader public's desire for closure. Polarization. While the Lungu family enjoyed strong support from PF supporters, the public remained divided. Some Zambians, particularly those aligned with the ruling United Party for National Development (UPND), supported the government's position that a state funeral was appropriate for a former president. This polarization reflected the broader political divide in Zambia, with Lungu's death and funeral becoming a flashpoint for unresolved tensions. 8. Is this political targeting? Evidence of political targeting. The Lungu family and their supporters, including the PF, have consistently argued that the Hichilema administration targeted Edgar Lungu and his family for political reasons. Several incidents support this claim. Post-2021 harassment. After losing the 2021 election, Lungu accused the government of placing him under virtual house arrest, restricting his movements, and preventing him from traveling abroad for medical treatment. In a May 2024 interview with the BBC, he claimed police harassment, including warnings against public jogging, which was labeled political activism. Anti-corruption investigations. The Hichilema administration's anti-corruption crusade targeted Lungu's family, with Esther Lungu facing charges of stealing cars and Tasila arrested for money laundering in in 2025. The family denied these allegations, framing them as politically motivated. Constitutional Court ruling. In December 2024, the Constitutional Court barred Lungu from running for president again, ruling that his 2015 to 2016 term counted as a full term. Some analysts suggested this was influenced by the UPND, particularly after Hichilema removed 3 justices who had ruled against him. Government's defense. The government, through Information Minister Cornelius Muitwa, denied allegations of targeting, describing claims of a travel ban or house arrest as fiction. Muitwa argued that Hichilema's administration was committed to avoiding the kind of persecution Hichilema faced under Lungu, such as his 2017 detention on treason charges. The government framed its anti-corruption efforts as necessary to address mismanagement during Lungu's presidency, which saw Zambia default on its debt in 2020. Analysis. The question of political targeting is complex. The Hichilema administration's actions, including the legal challenges to Lungu's family and the court ruling barring his candidacy, suggest a pattern of targeting political opponents. However, Lungu's presidency was not without controversy, as his administration was criticized for authoritarian tendencies and economic mismanagement. The funeral dispute itself, particularly the government's legal action in South Africa, reinforces the perception of targeting among Lungu's supporters, as it appears to prioritize state control over family wishes. Yet, the government's argument that a state funeral is a matter of national interest has legal and historical precedent, as seen in the case of Kenneth Kaunda. 9. What this means for Edgar Lungu's burial. Current status. As of July 5, 2025, Edgar Lungu's burial remains in limbo due to the Pretoria High Court's injunction. The family's decision to bury him in South Africa reflects their desire to honor his wish for a private ceremony free from Hichilema's involvement. However, the government's legal action and insistence on repatriation suggest that the dispute may continue until the August 4th court hearing, prolonging the uncertainty for mourners. Implications for Zambia. The burial dispute has exposed deep political divisions in Zambia, undermining the nation's tradition of peaceful transitions and unity in mourning. The government's actions risk alienating Lungu's supporters, while the family's resistance could set a precedent for future disputes over former presidents' funerals. The lack of a clear legal framework, as highlighted by John Sangwa, underscores the need for reform to balance family wishes with national interests. Legacy and memory. The location and nature of Lungu's burial will significantly shape how his legacy is remembered. A burial in South Africa would symbolize the family's rejection of the Hichilema administration and could galvanize opposition to the UPND in the lead-up to the 2026 elections. Conversely, a state funeral in Zambia could allow the government to project an image of reconciliation, though it risks being seen as a hollow gesture given the history of animosity. Conclusion. The death of Edgar Lungu and the subsequent funeral dispute have laid bare the deep political and personal divisions in Zambia. Tasila Lungu's statement was a poignant call for unity that highlighted the family's grief and their desire to control their father's legacy. The government's response, marked by a push for a state funeral and legal action in South Africa, has been criticized as politically motivated, while the public remains divided between support for the family and calls for national unity. The ongoing dispute threatens to overshadow Lungu's complex legacy, which includes significant infrastructure achievements, but also economic and political controversies. The resolution of this dispute, whether through mediation or a court ruling, will have lasting implications for Zambia's political landscape and its ability to honor its former leaders with dignity and unity.